Jalen walked through the hallways of Westbrook High with his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might glance his way. The whispers started as soon as he passed, too quiet for teachers to notice, but loud enough for the other students to hear. "There goes that boy," a voice muttered from behind him, followed by a soft chuckle. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Derek, always the first to laugh, always the one to call him boy, as though it was a joke, as if he were invisible, as if he didn't matter. Every day was the same. In class, the teachers hardly seemed to see him. He was just that boy in the back row. They praised the other students for their good grades, but when it came to him, they expected less. It was as though his presence didn't deserve their full attention. Even the guidance counselor, Mrs. Price, once said to him, "Well, you know, Jalen, with your background, you're doing better than most." The words stung more than they should have, but they weren't unusual. His whole life, he'd been labeled as just another boy, another stereotype to be dealt with. As Jalen moved past the cafeteria, he overheard a group of girls laughing. "I wonder if he'll try out for the talent show," one of them giggled. "Can you imagine? The boy who thinks he can rap. What a joke." The sound of their laughter followed him, echoing in his mind. It was like a weight that hung around his neck, pulling him down with every step. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his own thoughts. His friends, who were always kind to him, had encouraged him to enter the school talent show. "You've got skills, man," one of them had said. "You should show them what you're made of." But Jalen wasn't sure. His rhymes were sharp and clever. But what if they laughed? What if they mocked him even more? The fear of failure gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched, ready to be ridiculed. But despite the hurt, despite the whispering and the mocking, he refused to let them win. He clenched his fists, feeling the warmth of determination bubbling in his chest. Maybe he could prove them wrong. Maybe it was time to stop being just that boy. The bell rang, signaling the start of the assembly, and Jalen felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He made his way into the gymnasium, already half empty, the basketball courts gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. The students slowly filled in, chatting with friends and finding their seats. Jalen could already hear snippets of conversation as he walked past them, knowing that the whispers would soon begin again. "Think Jalen's gonna perform?" Derek's voice carried across the room, his tone full of mockery. "He'd better stay in the back where he belongs." A few people laughed, and Jalen forced his eyes forward, not letting the sting of their words touch him. But it was hard, so hard to ignore. The principal, Mr. Cunningham, stood at the front of the room, his broad smile and enthusiasm never quite reaching his eyes when it came to Jalen. "All right, students," Mr. Cunningham boomed, "it's that time again. The annual Westbrook High Talent Show is just around the corner. We've got some incredible performances lined up this year, and I'm sure you're all as excited as I am." His words were met with polite claps, but Jalen didn't hear the excitement. He heard the sarcasm in his voice, the way it seemed as if Mr. Cunningham had already written him off. "And," the principal continued, "we have one more contestant to announce. This student's talent might surprise you all. Please welcome Jalen Roberts." There was a split second of silence before the laughter began. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it was there. Quiet giggles, a few snickers, and whispers of, "He's really gonna do it?" The entire room seemed to turn its attention to him, like he was some kind of spectacle. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought about turning and walking out. The exit doors were right there, just a few steps away. But something in him refused to back down. Not now. Not after everything he'd been through. As Mr. Cunningham smiled, clueless to the tension in the air, Jalen stood tall, though his heart raced. He didn't let the mockery get to him. Not yet. "Maybe I'll show them something they didn't expect," Jalen muttered to himself under his breath, a fierce determination starting to burn in his chest. The rest of the assembly went on, but the whispers about Jalen didn't stop. As his name echoed in his mind, he realized that the real performance wouldn't be on that stage. It would be the one he put on to prove them all wrong. That night, Jalen sat alone in his bedroom, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His notebook lay open in front of him, the blank pages taunting him as if daring him to write. He ran his hand over his face, wiping away the sweat that had gathered on his forehead. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning, but inside his head, it was anything but quiet. He had tried to write, tried to compose something that would blow everyone away, but every time he picked up his pen, doubt filled his mind, and the words stopped flowing. What if I fail? What if they laugh? His thoughts circled like vultures, reminding him of every time he'd been overlooked, ignored, or called boy. They were always there, lurking in the background, ready to remind him of his place. Jalen slammed the notebook shut and stood up, pacing around his room. His sneakers scuffed the wooden floor as he walked back and forth, trying to shake the suffocating feeling of fear that was settling in. His palms were clammy, his chest tight. He felt like he was trapped, as if the walls of his room were closing in on him. He needed to write. He needed to create something. But how could he? How could he write a rap that would prove he was more than just a label, a stereotype? Every rhyme he'd ever written, every lyric that had once made him feel powerful, now seemed too small, too insignificant. He could almost hear the voices from school. He's just a boy. He's never gonna make it. He's got nothing to offer. The words cut deeper than he'd like to admit. His dad had always told him, "Son, don't listen to the noise. You're more than they can ever see." But even those words didn't seem to help now. Jalen sat down again, his fingers hovering over the pen. He thought about his dad, who'd always believed in him, even when the world didn't. The memory of his father's encouragement was like a small flicker of light in the darkness. He closed his eyes, remembering the way his dad had spoken to him, with such pride, even when the world around them told them both they were nothing. Maybe it's time to prove them wrong, he thought. Maybe it's time to stop being afraid. With a deep breath, he opened the notebook again. His fingers found the rhythm. The words came flowing this time. It was like something inside him had finally clicked. Each line was sharp, each word harder than the last. The crowd at school had no idea who they were dealing with. He wasn't just the boy they expected to fail. He was Jalen Roberts, and it was time they knew his name. The day of the talent show arrived, and the atmosphere at school was thick with anticipation and whispered jokes. Jalen could feel the tension hanging in the air, like a storm cloud ready to break. His palms were sweaty as he walked through the hallways. His head held a little higher than usual, but his nerves were eating him up from the inside. It wasn't the talent show that worried him. It was the crowd. He already knew what to expect. The laughter, the jeers, the feeling of being less than everyone else. As he turned the corner near the cafeteria, he heard a familiar voice, a sharp, cutting laugh that made his stomach churn. Derek, of course. He stood with a group of his friends, all of them snickering as Jalen passed by. "Yo, look at this!" Derek called out, loud enough for Jalen to hear. "The boy thinks he's gonna rap in front of the whole school. This is gonna be hilarious." A ripple of laughter ran through Derek's group. Jalen kept walking, his face burning, but his head still held high. He'd been called worse. It was just words. He tried to tell himself that, but it still stung, still hurt more than he cared to admit. By the time he reached the gymnasium, where the talent show would take place, the insults had followed him. "You sure you want to do this, boy?" Someone shouted from the hallway. "You're just gonna make a fool of yourself." Jalen's heart pounded in his chest and his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel their eyes on him, mocking, judging, waiting for him to fail. Inside the gym, the stage looked much bigger than he'd imagined. The spotlight was blinding, and the sound of the microphone feedback sent a shiver down his spine. As he walked past the other contestants, he overheard a few of them whispering, barely masking their amusement. "He's really doing this? What does he think he's going to prove?" one girl said, her voice dripping with disdain. Jalen ignored them as best as he could, but the laughter seemed to echo in his ears, growing louder with every step. He reached the backstage area and found a quiet corner to sit, closing his eyes to center himself. He needed to focus. He couldn't let them see how much they were getting to him, but the weight of it all pressed down on him. He wasn't just performing in front of a crowd. He was fighting for his dignity his worth, his place in a world that had always tried to keep him in the shadows. The whispers and insults weren't just random comments. They were symbols of the way he'd been labeled all his life. Boy, less than, not good enough. He took a deep breath and stood up, his hands trembling slightly. This is it. This is my moment, he told himself, though he wasn't sure if he believed it yet. The stage was waiting for him, and somehow he had to find a way to make them believe in him, even if they refused to see him for who he really was. Backstage, the air was thick with nervous energy. Contestants stretched, fidgeted with their props, and murmured among themselves. But Jalen barely noticed them. He stood in the corner, away from the crowd, his mind racing. The sounds of laughter and mockery from earlier still buzzed in his head like an angry bee, making it hard to focus. His heart beat fast, and he could feel the sweat trickling down his back, soaking his shirt. He was so close now, closer than he had ever been to proving everyone wrong. But just as he was about to close his eyes and prepare himself mentally, he heard footsteps approaching. Jalen looked up to see Derek walking toward him, a smug grin plastered across his face. The group of friends who had been laughing at Jalen earlier were trailing behind him, their eyes filled with unspoken judgment. "Hey, look who it is," Derek said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You ready to embarrass yourself in front of the whole school, Ahram boy?" He emphasized the last word as if to remind Jalen of the label that had stuck to him for as long as he could remember. Jalen felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't afraid of Derek. He wasn't afraid of any of them. But the way Derek said it, like it was all a joke, made Jalen's blood boil. He clenched his fists, his fingers tightening around the imaginary microphone in his hand. Derek was trying to get under his skin, and it was working. "You should just back out now," Derek continued, stepping closer. "I mean, who's really going to take you seriously? You're just a boy." He made air quotes with his fingers, his smile widening. "If I were you, I'd save myself the embarrassment." For a moment, Jalen was silent. His hands shook, and he fought the urge to snap back. He had been holding it all in, years of being labeled, judged, and pushed aside. And it was so tempting to lash out, to let Derek know how much his words hurt. But Jalen remembered what his father had told him. Don't let them see you break. Taking a slow, deep breath, Jalen lifted his chin, meeting Derek's eyes with a calmness he didn't feel. "I'm going out there," he said, his voice low but steady, "and you're going to hear me, whether you like it or not." He stood his ground, not backing down, not showing fear. Derek's grin faltered for a second, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You think you're going to make a difference? You're nothing, boy. Just a kid with a dream who's about to fall flat on his face." Jalen's gaze never wavered. He didn't need to say anything more. Derek was the one who didn't understand. "He's already decided who I am," Jalen thought, "but I don't need his approval." Without another word, Jalen turned and walked toward the stage entrance. His heart was still pounding, but now it was with purpose. "I'm going to show them all." The curtain in front of him parted, and the sound of the audience talking and laughing grew louder. But Jalen didn't hesitate. The moment he stepped into that spotlight, everything would change. The moment Jalen stepped onto the stage, the world seemed to shrink. The lights were blinding, and the entire gymnasium went silent. He could hear the faint buzz of the microphone feedback, the whisper of nervous breaths from the audience, and the thump of his own heart in his chest. For a brief second, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, the eyes of every student, every teacher, all on him. It was as if his entire existence had led to this one moment. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. The beat of his track began to play through the speakers, pulsing through his body like electricity. He could feel the rhythm under his skin, but the pressure was still there, heavy in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't the music he was afraid of, it was the crowd, the ridicule he had prepared for since he signed up for this. Those eyes, those voices that always mocked him, whispering the same thing. "You'll never make it. You're just a boy." For the first few seconds, he froze. His mind went blank. He could almost hear Derek's voice echoing in his head. "You're nothing. You'll fall flat on your face." But then, something inside him clicked. His dad's words came rushing back. "Don't let them see you break." Jalen closed his eyes for a split second, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, the fear was gone. All that was left was the music, the beat, and the truth he had to speak. He grabbed the mic, his fingers wrapping around it with determination. The first line came out, low but strong. "They call me boy, but I'm about to change the game." His voice echoed through the gymnasium, each word sharper than the last. The crowd was still, almost unnervingly so, as if they didn't know what to expect. He could feel their skepticism in the air, but that only fueled him. The rhythm picked up, and so did Jalen's flow. His words came faster now, smoother, as he began to rise into the music. Each verse hit harder than the one before it, each line a punch to the stereotypes, the labels, the judgments he had carried for so long. "They think they know me? They think they can tell me who I am?" Watch this. As he spat the final verse, his chest swelled with pride. His voice reverberated through the mic, bouncing off the walls. There was no turning back now. The fear was gone, replaced by the undeniable power of his words. Jalen was no longer just the boy in the back row. He was here, standing tall, claiming his space. The music faded out, but the silence remained for a moment. The gym was eerily quiet, and Jalen held his breath, waiting. Had he done enough? Had they heard him? Then the room erupted. First came the stunned silence, followed by a burst of applause, shouts and cheers. It wasn't just a polite clap. It was real. The audience was on their feet, some of them in shock, others in awe. Jalen's heart raced, but this time it wasn't fear. It was exhilaration. Derek's mocking smile from earlier flashed before his eyes, but now it seemed distant, irrelevant. This moment was his, and no one could take it away. The applause echoed in Jalen's ears like a distant thunderclap. His chest heaved with each breath, the adrenaline still coursing through him, but all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat, loud and fast. The gymnasium was alive with energy, but it felt like time had slowed down for him. He looked out at the sea of faces, each one staring back at him with wide eyes, some in disbelief, others in admiration. His throat tightened, but not from fear this time. It was from the shock of seeing them all, the students, the teachers, even Derek on their feet, clapping, cheering. Jalen had expected laughter, mockery, or at best polite applause. What he didn't expect was the raw, genuine reaction from the crowd. It was as if they hadn't known what they were missing until that very moment. He hadn't just performed, he had spoken to them. He had shown them something they hadn't seen before. For a moment, he allowed himself to bask in the sound of their applause, his hands still gripping the microphone, his legs shaky beneath him. It wasn't just about the performance, it was about the shift in the air, the way the room felt different now, the way the people in it saw him differently. But as the last applause faded, a voice pierced the silence, cutting through the buzz like a knife. "Well, well, well," Mr. Cunningham's voice boomed over the mic, his expression unreadable. "It seems we have a surprise performance from Jalen Roberts." There was an awkward pause as the principal looked out over the crowd, his face blank. Jalen's stomach tightened. He was used to being ignored, to being dismissed, but now it felt as though the weight of every word was magnified. Jalen stood there, unsure if he should smile, acknowledge the applause, or just keep his head down and wait for the inevitable. He could already feel the eyes on him again, some in admiration, others still skeptical. And then, unexpectedly, Mr. Cunningham continued. "Let's all give it up for Jalen," he said, and the crowd went wild again, louder than before. But Jalen could see the flicker of doubt in Mr. Cunningham's eyes, the attempt to suppress any trace of surprise or respect. It was as if the principal couldn't quite believe it. Jalen had just shattered every expectation placed on him, and now even the adults who had underestimated him were forced to reckon with it. Then Derek's voice broke through the noise. "Man, that was..." His words hung in the air as he awkwardly stepped forward, his hands still clapping, but with a forced edge. Jalen turned slightly, meeting Derek's gaze. The smug grin that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by a subtle look of confusion, even admiration. It was in that moment that Jalen realized something. It didn't matter if Derek understood. It didn't matter if the principal was still trying to process what had happened. What mattered was that the people who had been so quick to label him, to dismiss him, had just witnessed the strength he'd always known he had. Jalen stepped back, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But at that moment, they didn't matter either. All that mattered was the feeling of victory that washed over him, a victory that was more than just winning the talent show. It was the validation of everything he had fought for. For the first time, Jalen didn't need anyone's approval. He had proved it to himself. As the applause finally died down, Jalen walked off the stage, his heart still racing, but now filled with pride. He hadn't just changed their expectations, he changed his own. The gym was still buzzing when Jalen made his way off the stage, his steps quick and purposeful, but his mind was spinning. He couldn't fully process what had just happened. As he walked through the crowd of students, some patted him on the back, others gave him nods of approval, but Jalen barely noticed them. His thoughts were clouded, his mind still replaying the moment when he had stood under the spotlight, his words cutting through the air with raw emotion. He couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. Had he really done it? Had he really stood up there, faced the crowd, and delivered something that actually made them see him? Out of the corner of his eye, Jalen spotted Derek and his group of friends standing near the bleachers, their eyes glued to him. He couldn't tell if their expressions were ones of admiration or confusion. Derek caught his gaze, and for a brief moment, the two of them locked eyes. The smug, mocking grin that had been on Derek's face earlier was nowhere to be found. Instead, Derek simply looked uncertain, almost reluctant. Jalen couldn't help but wonder if this would be the moment everything changed for him. But as much as he wanted to believe that things would be different now, he knew better. It wasn't enough to just perform once. The real battle would be proving this wasn't a fluke, that he wasn't just another boy trying to break through. He was someone with a voice that couldn't be ignored. As he walked toward the exit, the sound of a familiar voice made him pause. It was Mr. Cunningham speaking to a group of teachers by the door. He hadn't heard everything, but he caught the end of the conversation. A good performance, yes, but it's clear he's had some help. Mr. Cunningham's voice trailed off, and Jalen felt a sharp pang of frustration in his chest. Help! It didn't matter how much preparation or guidance he had gotten. No one had helped him find the courage to stand on that stage and speak his truth. That was his doing, his fight. Jalen's shoulders tightened. He wanted to shout out, to make them all understand. But he knew that wouldn't change anything. Not yet. He'd have to prove it again, and again, until there was no denying his strength. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, Jalen took a deep breath, feeling the rush of emotions flooding through him. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to smile. He'd taken the mic. He'd stood up to the doubts, the ridicule, the labels, and come out on top. But the real journey was just beginning. He had proven he could rise above the noise. Now it was time to show everyone that this wasn't a one-time thing. He wasn't just going to let this moment define him. He was going to take this victory and keep moving forward, ready for whatever came next. The days following the talent show felt surreal. Jalen had expected to return to school the next morning and find himself the subject of whispers, the butt of jokes, or perhaps even an attempt at mockery from his classmates. But instead, things were quieter. There was an air of curiosity, a change that seemed to hang in the halls, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Jalen tried to focus on his classes, but it was impossible not to notice the subtle shift in the way people looked at him. Even Derek, who had been so openly dismissive before, seemed to look at Jalen with a kind of cautious respect now, though he tried to mask it with his usual bravado. The constant teasing and the nickname boy were still there, but they didn't feel as sharp anymore. It was as though the performance had cracked something open, a new reality where the labels didn't hold as much power. Jalen was starting to understand. This feeling of being seen, even if it was just a little bit more, was more powerful than anything he had experienced before. One afternoon, as he walked to the cafeteria, he spotted a group of students standing in a circle by the lockers. They were talking excitedly, but what caught Jalen's attention was the fact that the conversation stopped the moment he approached. He hesitated, the familiar unease creeping up his spine. He knew what this was, the quiet before the storm. The moments where they would decide whether to talk about him behind his back or worse, ignore him altogether. But then to his surprise, one of the girls in the group, Ashley, stepped forward. "Hey, Jalen," she said, her voice a little hesitant, but not mocking. "That was amazing what you did at the talent show. I didn't know you could, well, you know, rap like that." Jalen froze. Ashley, the girl who had never paid him any mind before? The one who usually laughed with the others during the class jokes at his expense? It was as if the world had shifted. She wasn't just acknowledging his talent, she was validating his existence. In that moment, everything felt different. The rest of the group nodded in agreement, their smiles genuine, not the kind of smiles that hid something else behind them. They weren't just humoring him, they were offering respect. A small victory, but it felt like a turning point in Jalen's journey. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a sense of pride he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. "I'm glad you liked it." He nodded to the group, still processing what had just happened. Then before he could say anything more, Derek walked by, a smirk still playing on his lips. But this time, when he saw Jalen standing there was no ridicule in his eyes. There was something else, something Jalen couldn't quite name, but it wasn't contempt. Jalen turned and walked into the cafeteria, his heart racing, but in a good way. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew that, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving in this school. He was starting to thrive, and this was only the beginning. The following weeks passed in a blur. Jalen felt like he was walking through a new world, one where he was no longer invisible, no longer the target of jokes and whispers. He wasn't sure when it happened, but he could feel it, the way the atmosphere around him had changed. He was no longer just the boy in the back of the class. He was Jalen Roberts, the student who had taken the mic and spoken the truth. And somehow that truth had shifted the entire balance. But with this new reality came challenges Jalen hadn't anticipated. There were still those who doubted him, who whispered behind his back, who tried to undermine his success. It wasn't always easy to ignore the sneers, the sideways glances. Some teachers still treated him as if he were beneath them, dismissing his potential as just a phase, a fluke. Jalen knew he'd have to prove them wrong, not just once, but every single day. He couldn't afford to let this newfound respect slip away. It wasn't enough to be seen. He had to make sure he kept showing up, kept speaking up, kept pushing forward. One day after class, he found himself in the hallway again, walking to his locker. He was lost in thought, thinking about the next step in his journey, when he heard a familiar voice. It was Ashley again, this time with a group of students surrounding her. She was laughing, her voice high and clear. But when she saw Jalen approaching, the laughter seemed to fade. "Jalen," she called out, her smile warm but tinged with uncertainty. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Jalen stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what this was about, but the way she looked at him, like she was about to say something important, made him nervous. "Sure," he said, his voice steady, though his palms were starting to sweat. The group of students hung back, allowing them space. Ashley stepped closer. "I've been thinking," she started, her eyes locking onto his. "That performance you gave, it wasn't just about the talent. You made us all see something we hadn't really thought about before. I mean, how many of us were just assuming stuff about you, about who you are? And now we know better. I think a lot of people want to make things right." Jalen blinked, trying to process her words. For a moment, it felt like everything around him was standing still. "I'm sorry for how I treated you before," Ashley continued, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I didn't really see you, but now I do, and I think you deserve way more than we gave you." Jalen didn't know what to say at first. The apology, the recognition, it was overwhelming. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped for respect, but this was something else entirely. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate that. But it's not just about me, Ashley. It's about everyone. If I can show just one person that they can be more than what people expect, then that's all I need." Ashley smiled, her expression genuinely moved. "You already did that, Jalen." As the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Jalen walked out of the school, his thoughts racing. It wasn't just the victory at the talent show anymore. It wasn't just the performance or the applause. It was the way he had changed the narrative, his narrative, and, in doing so, had helped others rewrite theirs. Jalen was no longer just the boy. He was someone who had taken control of his own story. And that was just the beginning.